Now in this video I'm going to revisit I should say, a very broad trade-off that I mentioned in an earlier part of this course. And I'm referring here to the trade-off between current and future living standards that I mentioned or explained when I was explaining to you why this resource of capital. Remember, there are four resources: land, labor, capital, and enterprise. And I explained to you that this capital is a very sort of a special resource, because this is a resource that can itself be made in factories using your current stock of all the four resources. But I explained that the reason the countries shy away from accumulating a lot of capital and therefore accumulating a lot of resources eventually is that if in the current year you start using most of your resources to make capital goods, then you will have to give up on your current living standards. You won't be able to produce all the nice things that are going to give you satisfaction in this current year. Consumer goods such as TVs and bikes and so on and so forth. Now, once we understand the basic model of production possibilities curve and how it allows us to read the trade-offs between two different goods that a country can make, we can now study this trade-off between current and future living standards in a much more useful way and a much more important way, because what we are going to learn shows up pretty much directly in your MCQs. So the idea here is that you see, if the country, as I said, if it produces a lot of capital goods, then yes, it can have a very good future living standard, but then it won't have enough resources to produce enough consumer goods and therefore give you enjoyment in the current year. Now we show this trade-off by assuming that on one of the axes of this PPC we measure the total amount of capital goods that a country can produce, and on the other axis we measure the amount of consumer goods that this country can produce. And then the sort of trade-off is very obvious. Start at this point where all the resources are in consumer goods, and as you move along this PPC, what are you doing? You're moving to the right, and every time you move right you are coming down. That is, you can make more capital goods, but you will have to give up consumer goods. You can make more capital goods, have a better future living standard, but you will have to rely or bear with fewer consumer goods and a poorer current living standard. That's the trade-off that is being depicted in this downward sloping graph of PPC. But there are a few more details that we need to know, and for that we first of all need to introduce the idea of depreciation. Now, depreciation simply means that, look, yes, capital is a resource that can be made by human beings in factories, and once it's made, it will be used again and again to make more goods and services. But all of your tools and equipment and machinery, things that you call capital, and they won't live on forever. Eventually, these goods will die. They will wear out. Your tools, your equipments, your machineries, your harvesters. And the technical way of saying that is that, look, there will also be some depreciation. You can make more capital goods every year, but some of these capital goods, they will die every year. They will depreciate. They will come to an end of their life. So the decision that the country needs to make is not only related to how many capital goods that I'm going to make, it also needs to take into account how many capital goods are being depreciated. And that overall will tell you that maybe you end up with more capital goods by the end of this year, or fewer capital goods. So for instance, let's assume in our country the amount or units of capital that depreciate every year is equal to 20. So 20 units of capital die every year. And this is where we are saying that, look, if you don't even make 20 units of capital every year, then you are not even going to replace the capital goods that are dying, that are depreciating. So let's assume you just make 5 new capital goods this year and your depreciation is 20. It means next year you will start with 15 less units of capital. Whereas given a depreciation of 20 in every year, you at least need to make 20 units of capital, and then you will start the next year with the same amount of resources, the same amount of capital. Whereas given this depreciation of 20 every year, only if you make more than 20 capital goods, only then will you end up having more capital, more resources in the next year. Now this has important implications for our PPC. And the way we show that on this graph is that we can mark out this amount of depreciation of 20 over here on the x-axis, on the axis that is measuring the amount of capital goods that we are going to make. And all we are saying now is that, look, if you pick any combination on this PPC and through that combination, if you are ending up making more than 20 capital goods, that is, this point is where you are making 20 capital goods and this much of consumer goods. Any point to the right of this point on the PPC, any combination within this region over here would tell you that you are making capital goods which are more than 20. So this is where you are saying that you are in this scenario here. Any combination on this part of PPC means you are producing more capital than what you are depreciating. So in all of these regions, your amount of capital goods next year will be higher, they will increase. Whereas if you produce anywhere in this part of the PPC, if you pick up any of this combination in this part, all of these combinations are telling you that, look, you are going to end up making capital goods which are less than the amount that is going to be depreciated. So let's say this is 5. So if your country operates at this combination, it is telling you that, look, I'm going to make 5 capital goods, but 20 capital goods will die, which means next year in all of this region over here, the country will start with fewer or lesser amount of capital goods. Now link this up with the shifts of PPC. If you are picking a combination this year within this region, you will end up with more capital or more resource the next year, and therefore your PPC will shift outward the next year. Whereas if you are producing in this region, where you end up with amount of capital goods which is less than what is going to be depreciated, then you will end up with fewer capital goods next year, fewer resources next year, and your PPC will shift downwards or inside. And that is what the examiner will test you upon. He will make a PPC like this. He will tell you that he's taking capital goods here, consumer goods here, and he will tell you that, look, this point A measures the amount of depreciation. And then he will ask you, if a country produces at point B this year, will it PPC shift outward or inward in the coming year? And the answer is that, look, if this is the amount of capital that is depreciated, if my country produces this combination, it means it is going to produce more capital goods than it is going to depreciate. So it will add up to its capital stock. Next year, it will end up with more resources, and therefore PPC will shift outwards.